My name is Danny Siegel, and today we're going to be doing the Champion Briefs April topic analysis on Resolve. The United Nations should grant India permanent membership on the Security Council. Before I start, April is a really exciting month for PF debate. Not only do we have tournaments like the Tournament of Champions, but there's also tournaments like the National Debate Coaches Association, which is a really good practice for TOC, as well as I'm pretty sure a decent amount of state tournaments are also on the April topic. Now that we covered that, let's talk about specifics of the topic. Before we actually start talking about strategy on the topic, as well as the individual arguments that I think will be probably the most run arguments on the topic, here's a little bit of background info just about the United Nations in general, so everyone can get an understanding of how the Security Council works, as well as the other institutions you might be talking about on the topic. So start out, who is the Security Council? So there are 15 members on the Security Council, 5 are actually permanent, and then there are 10 non-permanent members. The permanent members, you could probably assume Russia, the United States, China, France, and the UK. The other 10 are elected on a regional basis and only serve about 2 terms. Something you have to understand about the 5 permanent members is they all have veto power and can essentially shut down resolutions even if they just get one individual state to veto, or one individual country to essentially just like veto whatever they happen to be talking about and not pass that motion. You can probably guess how states align. Most democratic states usually work together to stop like autocratic resolutions that like would promote Russia, Chinese strength. Like the United States, United Kingdom, and France usually shut down different types of motions that would like allow for Russia and China to become more belligerent in certain regions, as well as if they just want to increase their control over wherever they are in the world. China and Russia generally work together in order to curb like U.S., French, English interests. Something to know about the Security Council is they have a few different responsibilities in regards to the international community. One, they are the council that is responsible for establishing peacekeeping operations. That's going to be really important when we start talking about individual arguments in terms of what I think is probably going to be the more often read arguments on the topic or the stock arguments on the topic. Second, they can essentially decide what countries end up getting sanctions as the international community is involved. And third, they are the council that essentially can authorize military force and not necessarily allow, because they don't have the power to like not allow a country to do something, but I guess sanction or say it is okay if a country were to invade or essentially like launch airstrikes on another country. So something to realize is obviously the world is in anarchy all the time, and the United Nations Security Council doesn't really have the ability to enforce much. What it is it's a really important institution for the most powerful nations to come together and discuss issues that affect the global community as well as the strength of their own states. So I think that's something to realize on the topic, especially if you're affirmative. You're not going to be able to say that the United Nations Security Council is able to essentially like rule the world, because in reality, they do a lot of things and pass a lot of motions, but generally the world doesn't listen to those motions. However, that doesn't make it necessarily a useless institution. It is still extremely important to have in the world. Just having a institution that allows for conflict resolution in the international community. So before we dive into more specifics of India, let's talk a little bit about how I think different strategies of how to view the Security Council power on this topic. So we're going to be talking a little bit about realism and liberalism, which are 2 different viewpoints in regards to how you view like world politics, as well as just like countries and how they interact with one another. Realism is essentially the belief that the world is just naturally chaotic, and no matter what international institutions attempt to do, countries are always going to act in their self-interest to survive. Realists generally argue that countries are constantly competing against one another in order to like gain more power. This is really important because it essentially takes the viewpoint that countries are always seeking to influence other countries as well as to just like grow in strength. And no matter what the United Nations does, it can't really control that. No matter what the Security Council does, they can't really control that. States are like naturally, inherently aggressive. How this relates to the Security Council is, if you're a negative team, you can argue that the Security Council doesn't really have much power and states are going to do whatever's in their self-interest. The Security Council passes a motion that says authorization of military force is okay for invading a certain country. If they say that the international community should sanction a country, realists would argue that if the Security Council voted down on any one of those motions, the international community would have acted essentially the same way, and they can't really control what the international community does because it's just naturally in a state of anarchy. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is a little bit about liberalism. These individuals have a lot more optimistic view in regards of how international institutions work. They believe that international institutions play a key role in how countries interact in the global security environment. More importantly, they believe that these institutions provide mechanisms for states to work together and reduce conflict. So liberalists essentially argue that the United Nations, the Security Council, while it might not have like 100% ability to change the way countries act, it at least influences it in some particular way, which is important because it means less conflict, less bloodshed, or if it's not related to war, less chaos in the international community, essentially. So for a second, let's be real. Which one of these is more true? Is liberalism the more true theory, or is realism the more true theory? It's definitely somewhere in the middle. States, I would say, always act in their own interest to increase power. However, when conflicts are likely, it's important to have an international institution for them to essentially be able to have conflict resolution there. And international bodies provide some sort of dispute mechanism. So I would say probably neither one of those theories is more true than one another. It's probably more likely in the middle. International institutions are important, but really lack a ton of power. It's also important to note you can't really know which one is more true simply because it's difficult to tell, since states in the international system never really tell their true intentions of why they're doing something. If the United Nations decided to authorize military force for a country to intervene, the country intervening could say that they did so because the United Nations said it was big enough of an issue for them to do so, when in reality, they could have already had all the conflict plans to invade, whether the United Nations said it would be okay for them to invade or not. So because of that, we can't really ever truly know empirically whether realism or liberalism is necessarily true. And because there are so many countries in the international community and so many conflicts, it's impossible to just like paint a picture and say like, this is always the case, this is always not the case. I hope a little bit of that will provide you with ability to find more offensive arguments and understand how the international community essentially works to use to your advantage. Now let's talk a little bit about the topic more specifically. Something unique to this topic is on the UNCLOS topic, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas topic, you talked a lot about international law, but this, I think you're going to be doing that significantly less, because on the UNCLOS topic, both teams essentially agreed that international law was going to be followed no matter what. On this topic, the negative team could say that the Security Council really doesn't matter whatsoever, it doesn't really have much power. That opens a lot more ground, I at least think, on the topic, and makes it interact more with the real world, rather than a world in which disadvantages and advantages are all based upon whether countries are following international law, whether they're based upon countries following international law, and whether that being good or bad. So that's something we need to realize, and makes this topic, I think, a little bit more advanced than the UNCLOS topic. Not in regards to topic knowledge, but more in regards to strategy. Now, something else you need to realize about the Security Council is something else we need to talk about the topic is the resolution itself is not a question of like policy, right? It's a question of like membership. And I think that's really important because there are very few, well, there's only one way a country could be added and get a seat to the United Nations Security Council, and that is if they got 2/3 of the vote from the General Assembly, and then every single country on the United Nations Security Council approving them. That's significant because it means the affirmative team, they have the fiat power, right, or the ability to make the resolution true to put India on the Security Council and give them a seat. I think that's super interesting simply because unlike a lot of other topics like the capital gains tax or the reparations topic that were topics in the past related to the United States Congress and what they would do, this has to do with literally 2/3 of the world as well as all the most powerful countries on earth coming together to agree something should happen. That's huge, just simply because there are a lot more implications to something like that happening. So now let's talk a little bit about arguments, why you're really here. Let's start out with the pro. So I split up the two types of arguments on this topic, or the two types of arguments both on the affirmative or the negative. One is a more utilitarianism approach. The other one would be like a more, this country should just have a seat because they've done stuff in the past. And I'm going to be talking about a little bit of the strategy of doing both of those things, and then specifically about arguments that fall under each of them. The utilitarianism approach, or like the more pragmatic approach on the topic, which I think are probably the better arguments on the topic. The first one that I think is probably going to be the biggest argument on the topic is I think a lot of teams are going to argue that India getting a seat would allow for greater peacekeeping operations. And the reason why I think that's going to be a big argument is because India is primarily the person who, or primarily the country that provides the most amount of troops to peacekeeping operations. Therefore, if they were to have a seat, they probably would be more likely to actually engage in conflict. Or you could argue they wouldn't engage in as much conflict because their people are actually involved or have a stake, and they don't want to put those individuals at risk. And I think that really matters because a lot of individuals believe that peacekeeping actually can promote stability in a lot of regions of the world. And there are a lot of peacekeeping missions that essentially operate to reduce bloodshed in conflict-heavy zones. I think it's not only going to be an important argument related to stability, but I think in regards to the link, whether peacekeepers actually go up or go down is going to be highly contested because I think it operates as both an affirmative and negative argument, not only through whether up being good and down being bad, through up being bad and down being good, or vice versa. And I think there will be really interesting debates on what teams essentially read related to peacekeeping, and I think there's going to be a lot of clash there. Another argument that I think is going to be probably popular on the pro is going to be curbing Chinese hegemony. There's a lot of literature on India being able to power project to prevent autocratic reforms in the future in China, or stopping China's influence in the South China Sea as well as in other areas of the world. Not only is this true because India is a rising global power, but it's also true simply because they're geographic neighbors. That's really big because military threat matters a lot more if you are nearby a country rather than overseas like the United States. It also makes conflicts more likely to occur simply because miscalculation can happen so much easier if you're right nearby rather than far away. Another argument that I think you can essentially say on the affirmative is you can talk a lot about Asian interests and what those might particularly look like, and how India getting a seat could possibly help those in the future, possibly even helping China, and that being a possibly good thing. So now let's move on to the other types of arguments that I think are available on the affirmative side that are a lot less pragmatic. I don't think these are particularly good arguments, and I would encourage you to not fall into the trap by reading them, but obviously do what you think or read what you think would be the best arguments on the topic. I could be 100% wrong. I just think there aren't that many impacts to these types of arguments. And the first one we're going to be talking about is just these are all under this category, but just justifications why India should get a seat. You could argue India has nuclear weapons, India is a growing superpower, India is doing this, India is doing that, or they've done that in the past, therefore they are justified to get a seat. Like, that's an argument you can make, but there's not really much of an impact, right? You could say India has nuclear weapons and the Security Council has a lot of talks on nuclear proliferation, and it would be useful to have another country with nuclear capabilities on the Security Council to influence nearby countries like Pakistan into not necessarily having nukes anymore. You have to really, I know that's a stretch of an argument, but you really have to stress and prove not only why India deserves a seat, but why it's bad or good that India should get a seat, rather than just simply saying India deserves a seat. You need to go that extra mile, because if you're hitting arguments where people are telling you it's going to be really bad if India gets a seat, and you're just saying India has nukes, they deserve a seat, obviously you can assume which team to vote for simply just because one team has an impact and the other doesn't whatsoever. So now let's move on to the con. In my opinion, I think this is probably the stronger side. Why do I think that? Just because I think there are a ton of backlash arguments on this topic, or especially on the con side. These are generally not the best arguments you can read, but because this question, or because the topic is not a question of policy, it's more of a question of like membership at the United Nations, I think this is more probable what would happen in the real world, especially what countries think about India, rather than, like, people have a lot more beliefs about who gets a say in things than they do about what policy gets implemented, simply because who gets a say affects what policy gets implemented, while policy being implemented is probably easier to repeal rather than removing an individual that has a vote on the Security Council to keep themselves there, if that makes sense whatsoever. That's why backlash arguments are probably going to be a lot better arguments on this topic than I think on previous topics. The types of arguments that I think you can be talking about, I think this will be the most obvious, and I think there's the most amount of literature on this, just aggravating Pakistan. The implications are pretty big, considering that Pakistan has nuclear weapons, as well as the fact that there's a huge conflict happening in Kashmir right now, and I think it'd be interesting to see how India getting a seat on what some might argue the most powerful legislative body in the world affects how Pakistan not only views them, but possibly views the international community as like a non-biased mediator in that conflict. Not only does Pakistan have nuclear weapons, but they also have access to a lot of valuable resources, and they work together with the United States as well as other countries to provide a lot of important intelligence to curb terrorist organizations across the region, which is pretty important considering that that can impact into lives. The other argument, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, is I think you can also make the argument that peacekeeping operations, if they go up, they're bad, simply because a lot of literature is about how peacekeeping operations can harm the stability of countries, and I think that's kind of strategic if somebody's reading peacekeeping good, simply because it allows you to bite into the link of AF and say that peacekeepers do in fact go up, but rather maybe stability gets worse, and it allows for a lot of clash to happen there. I would encourage you on these types of arguments that are available on both the affirmative and the negative, especially those where there are increased links and decreased links on the affirmative and the negative, and bad and good on both sides. I would encourage you to look for like twists in the type of argumentation, so that way you can do a little bit of a strategy that's kind of like a bait and switch, where some team hears you reading something about peacekeeping going up and that being bad, and they respond with their answer to blocks peacekeeping operations going up bad, and then you can essentially answer those saying that's not our argument, and possibly reading something like we're not saying all peacekeeping is bad, but rather India or all peacekeeping is good. It's that India would promote worse/better peacekeeping operations in general rather than them just being bad or good. I think that's the better types of argumentation you want to be reading, especially on those stock arguments that most people are going to be reading. Look for those types of twists in these stock arguments so that way you can be ahead of the game in terms of strategy and possibly confuse your opponents into thinking you're reading an argument when you're in fact not. And again, on the con, there are arguments that are less pragmatic, like we talked about before, where you can essentially say, like, India doesn't necessarily deserve a spot on the Security Council simply because they're not a developed country, or that they have a lot of corruption problems, X, Y, Z. These are not necessarily the best arguments you can make. However, if you can show why these arguments impact the real world negatively, I think those are possible arguments you can read in the round. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about weighing and framework. I would encourage everyone to focus on arguments that have impacts that are actually going to occur in the real world rather than just the justifications that we talked about earlier in the topic analysis. Other things about framework is I think teams need to realize on this topic, just because there is an argument, you can read it. On any international topic, you can always impact into nuclear war or huge different types of impacts. I would encourage you to probably look for the arguments that are more true, simply because those arguments are going to be not only believed by parents, but I think teams, at least this late in the year, are going to be able to recognize the arguments that probably have too big of an impact to even be true, and simply be able to belittle the argument really effectively by saying or by looking to literature that proves that those things don't necessarily happen in the real world. I would encourage you to not necessarily take the stance on affirmative that the Security Council has the most amount of power of all time, that they are the biggest and most powerful legislative body in the international community, but rather concede a little bit that maybe they don't have a ton of power, however find arguments that still lend some sort of impact to India getting a seat, and why that might be necessarily good for the international community. That's about all I have. I want to thank everyone so much for watching this video. I encourage everyone to go on to the Champion Briefs website, check out their institute, as well as sign up for the briefs and look at the new arguments that are going to be coming out on this topic. I'm excited to see what April is going to look like, especially at circuit tournaments like the Tournament of Champions, as well as the NDCA. Good luck to everyone, and I hope to see you there.